All right, thank you. I'm going to remove my mask here for this part. Uh, those of you, some of you may be aware that every semester we sponsor a book that is related to the theme of the semester. And so this semester, our theme has been Challenges to Democracy. Those of you who have been participating in our series throughout the semester, you've seen some discussion of the various challenges that are faced, that we face in democracy, right? Trying to encourage democracy both in the United States and around the world. And so we're very grateful that we have one of the world's leading authorities on democracy and democratic health in Larry Diamond. So what I'm going to do is turn the time over to Quinn Meekum, who is the coordinator of our Middle Eastern Studies program, as well as a professor of political science here at BYU, and he's a former student of Professor Diamond as well. So he will introduce him, and then we'll turn the time over to Professor Diamond. So, Quinn.
Thank you very much, Professor Benful. What a pleasure it is for me to welcome Larry Diamond to speak to us virtually today. I've been a fan of Professor Diamond for many years, ever since I was in graduate school at Stanford University and had an opportunity to learn from him and to be exposed to his particular style of realism and hope for the future. I've always been encouraged at Larry's remarkable commitment to democratic values, while at the same time recognizing the very real challenges that democracies face. That democracies aren't everything to everybody, but play a particular role in promoting good governance, unlike other types of regimes. Larry Diamond is coming to us from Palo Alto, California. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, which is an important academic institution on the Stanford University campus. He's also at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He has chaired the Hoover Institution project on the Indo-Pacific region and the project on Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific. He is a principal investigator of the Global Digital Policy Incubator at Stanford. He has directed the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and has led the program on Arab reform and democracy. Professor Diamond is remarkably prolific as a scholar. He's one of the hardest working people I know. And he's published many, many books on democracy, including the one that we've chosen this semester as our book of the semester. He spent a lot of time thinking about the United States and Iraq after the United States invaded Iraq and tried to establish, in cooperation with Iraqi partners, the new democratic institutions in that country and some of the challenges of that process. And he, more than anyone else I personally know, Professor Diamond has the ability to think about democracy in its global diversity of manifestations, to understand what it means to consolidate democracy, what it means to have a healthy democracy, and has traveled so widely and published so extensively on a wide variety of countries in the world. One of his biggest contributions, in my mind, is that he is one of the original founders and editors of the Journal of Democracy. The Journal of Democracy has been a remarkable force for good in political science in helping us think about comparative democracy around the world for many, many years. And more than anyone I know, Professor Diamond has really shaped my understanding and the understanding of many political scientists of how we should interpret democratic institutions, democratization, and democratic health. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Larry Diamond to BYU.
Great. Well, thank you, Quinn, and thank you, Stan, and thank you, students of BYU. It is so heartening to see students in a classroom. You can only imagine how much we wish for that at Stanford University. I'm going to share my screen now and share my slides with you. For about the next 40 minutes or so, give you a kind of updated take on much of the analysis and many of the arguments in my book, Ill Winds. And then I'll welcome your questions. I am going to go pretty rapidly, but and in some cases, I think you will wish that you could kind of ponder some of these slides longer and study the data in them. But I'm going to share these slides with your professors who will share them with you. And I'll also be able to, answer questions later if you have them. So, from my book, my view of democracy, that democracy rests on three equally important legs if it's going to be a liberal or high quality democracy. And it's not just about majority rule, which many, I'd say, political opportunists in the era we're living in now are trying to reduce it to. A liberal democracy also depends on what I call liberal government, not in terms of liberal versus conservative, but in terms of the founding principles of the American Constitution. You will recall that our founders deeply feared the potential for tyranny of the majority, and so entrenched significant minority rights into the Constitution, and then immediately the Bill of Rights to protect individual freedom. And the third leg of liberal democracy is good governance in terms of a rule of law and checks and balances and so on. Now, this is a snapshot of what the world looked like on December 31st of last year. And I'm giving you here the extent to which democracy was present at two levels in each region of the world. And unfortunately, Quinn, your region, the Middle East and North Africa, as you so well know and have been writing about for a long time, isn't doing very well in the right-hand far-right bars. But the light blue bar indicates the percentage of states in a region that are that are electoral democracies. And then the orange bar is the subset of those that also meet a higher test of liberal democracy, which for me is if a country gets a 1 or a 2 on the 7-point scale of political rights and the same on civil liberties for the Freedom House scale, one of the 2 best scores, I'll call it a liberal democracy. So Western Europe and US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they're all liberal democracies now. Pacific Island states, mainly so. Central and Eastern Europe, mainly democracies, but no longer Hungary. A couple others are in trouble. Poland is in deep trouble. And there is a slide underway that is moving away from liberal democracy. Latin America and the Caribbean, well, obviously not Cuba, Venezuela, or Nicaragua. No longer Bolivia, Peru's in trouble. Only about half of the countries of the region meet the test of liberal democracy. And then you can see the percentage declines as you go down to each of the other regions. Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, the 12 states of the former Soviet Union that are not the Baltic states, those are grouped with Central and Eastern Europe, and then the Middle East and North Africa. Note that these 3 big regions, Latin America and the Caribbean, Asia, and Africa, were all significantly more democratic 7 years ago than they are today. So I want to talk about first what's been happening, the deepening recession of freedom and democracy. And again, the blue line tracks the progress of electoral democracy, the orange line, the progress of liberal democracy. And you know from my book that the world was transformed by the third wave of global democratization, which rose gradually through the 1970s and 80s and then experienced a big bang of democratic expansion with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the democratization of Central and Eastern Europe, the emergence of a few other post-Soviet democracies, and very dramatic democratization of sub-Saharan Africa. By 2006, we experienced something we'd never had in the history of the world before. A decisive majority of states over 1 million population, and those under 1 million are even more democratic, but I'll look now at only the larger states over 1 million population. Nearly in 3 and 5 of them were democracies, and a peak of 34% of all these states were liberal democracies. Since then, this is the dawn of the democratic recession here in 2006. And you see there's been a slight decline down to 54%. And then the steady drop in the last about, decade or so, and particularly in the last few years. And last year, with the demise of 5 more democracies in countries like Bolivia, Senegal, and the Philippines, we have a situation, in my judgment, that we haven't had since the end of the Cold War, where it is no longer the case that the majority of sizable states in the world meet a minimum test of electoral democracy. In other words, they can no longer choose and replace their leaders in free and fair elections, even though national elections are still in most cases regularly held, and superficially, it may look very similar to before. Of course, a reason for this is that we've been experiencing a rising pace of democratic breakdowns. This updates data that I presented in my book. Note that I divide the last 44 years into 4 11-year segments. And note that in the first one, as the third wave was just gathering momentum, about 14% of all the democracies in the world, about 1 in 7 states, broke down. The failure rate for democracy in the world declined in the next 2 long decades to under 11%. About 1 in 9 democracies were breaking down. And now, in the most recent 11-year period, including through the end of last year, the failure rate has gone up to 18%. That's nearly 1 in 5 democracies breaking down. And overall, in this 44-year period, 35% of all the democracies that have existed have failed. We also see a declining rate of democratic transition. So now I'm doing just the reverse and asking, of all the authoritarian regimes that existed in this period, what percentage made transitions to democracy? And around the end of the Cold War and in the early post-Cold War period, you can see that nearly half of the authoritarian regimes in the world made transitions to democracy. That rate declined to 24% in the next period, and it's declined to 18% in the subsequent period. As a result, when you look at the balance between the number of countries losing their democracy and the number of countries making a transition to democracy, the last 11-year period, ending at the end of last year, has been the first, let's say, long decade since the start of the third wave, where the balance has shifted negative and more countries are leaving democracy than are moving toward it. And you can see this is really a function of the last 5 years, where the rate was favorable in the early 5-year periods. We kind of leveled off beginning in the mid-1990s. But in the last 5 years, we've moved decisively into negative territory. only 60% as many countries are moving toward democracy as the number that are moving away from it. And the same is true with freedom. Here you see, it's an updated slide from my book, the ratio of countries gaining in freedom in any particular year since the end of the Cold War in relation to the number of countries that are declining in freedom. And this is looking at the 100-point scale of Freedom House's political rights and civil liberties. It's a finer grained scale than the 7-point scale. And the 7-point scale is based on the 100-point scale. So again, look at 1991, the beginning of the post-Cold War period. 2.5 times as many countries improved their freedom score as the number that declined. That leveled off quickly in the next 3 years, but in virtually every subsequent year until 2005, you had 1.5 times, often 2.5 times as many countries gaining in freedom as the number that declined in their freedom score. That reached parity again in 2006. And in every one of the last 14 years since 2007, more countries have declined in freedom than have gained. And the ratio of gainers to decliners has really only been about 50 to 70%. So this shows pretty strongly the power and unfortunately persistence of the global democratic recession. And of course, some countries have been declining in their 100-point freedom scores much more than other countries. You see, the biggest loser here has been Turkey, followed by Venezuela. This is a huge decline on a 100-point scale. Hungary is next, then Poland. And after that, the US is top. That's been lost on the combined score, 100-point score of political rights and civil liberties. And you can see here exactly what that's been since 2012. If you compare the US with some peer democracies, Canada, Japan, Britain, Germany, and so on, the United States is now the worst performing major industrial democracy. And we're well behind not only Sweden, but Canada, Germany, Japan, and so on. We're not even doing that much better than some other emerging market economies like Israel, South Africa, the Philippines, Brazil, Hungary, and so on. So this is disturbing territory. And if you read the annual democracy survey, the Democracy Index of The Economist magazine, you may know that a year and a half ago, The Economist magazine demoted the United States to the status of a flawed democracy. So what's happening here? As I noted in my book, and as you see, I hope vividly in these slides, what's worrisome is that in the last 14 years, and particularly in recent years, we're seeing a general downward slide toward increasing authoritarianism or declining democracy in all categories of regimes. Many of the liberal democracies of the world, including the US, Brazil, and Poland, are becoming less liberal and I think less stable. Electoral democracies that maybe weren't very liberal, but at least look like robust electoral democracies have been breaking down. You see a number of them here. The category that I talk about in my book and that was introduced by Steve Levitsky and Lucan Way in their book on competitive authoritarianism, of regimes that aren't democracies but still allow a lot of political pluralism, opposition presence in the legislature, and so on, they're being drained of all their pluralistic content. And countries like Tanzania, Uganda, and Cambodia are just becoming naked one-party dictatorships. And then you have the authoritarian regimes that made no pretense of pluralism, but that are becoming even more repressive, like Russia, China, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Moreover, another indicator of the trouble we're in, I think, during this period of democratic recession, and an indicator of, one of the causes, is the decline and weakness of the rule of law. I'm not going to show you this same slide for every region. You'll see Latin America in a minute. But I can tell you that in almost every region, you see a huge gap between how well countries are doing on transparency and the rule of law and how well they're doing on political rights and civil liberties. Now, let me just explain. What I've done here is I've taken the 100-point scale of political rights and civil liberties. Political rights are measured by 40 points, civil liberties by 60 points. I've taken out the measures that relate to judicial independence, control of corruption, transparency, due process, and grouped them together into a new scale that I call transparency and the rule of law. And then I've simply standardized these numerical measures on a scale from 0 to 1. And we see here, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, that all three scales have declined in the last 14, 15 years. But transparency and the rule of law has declined the most, and there's a very big gap between the two. This is for Latin America. You don't really see much change in transparency and the rule of law, but look how big their gap there is between rule of law and the other two indicators. So next I want to talk about how. How is this happening? How is democracy declining and disappearing? It's mainly not been by the old vehicle of a military coup, though that did happen in Thailand, or an executive coup where a leader like Alberto Fujimori just stands up and says, the country's in crisis, only I can fix it. I'm closing down the Congress and suspending the Constitution. Rather, it's much more subtle as illiberal populists rise and make extraordinary claims about the corrupt nature of the democratic system and the need for them to concentrate power in order to save it. We know who many of these actors are. Putin, of course, kind of began the slide toward authoritarianism in the world with his destruction of a troubled democracy in Russia. And then Viktor Orban, I'd say, has been the poster child for these illiberal populist techniques. But you also have the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who has implemented this same autocrat's program that I'm going to talk about. Sheikh Hasina, the Bangladeshi prime minister, the Philippine president, Rodrigo Duterte. And now we have other elected leaders of democracies in Mongolia, most worrisomely in India, Narendra Modi, who I think has become a really imminent threat, not just to liberal democracy, but to democracy in India, and the Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro. What is populism? It's a political style, a political line of mobilization and argument that has these 7 elements. It's anti-elitist. It claims that elites are all corrupt, self-serving individuals, and the populist leader and party then presents itself as a pure and democratic alternative. But it's not really democratic. because it's deeply opposed to pluralism. And it really says, the political system is full of corrupt and illegitimate actors who don't really have a right to compete. Only I can fix it. Only we can fix it. And so it's got deeply hegemonic tendencies, claiming to be the only legitimate representative of the true people. And it poses this polar distinction between corrupt elites who've captured and destroyed the country and the virtuous true people who are struggling against great odds to save it. It's anti-institutionalist with an acute distrust of institutions. It's plebiscitary. It doesn't believe in the indirect and representative or filtered mechanisms that our founders put into the Constitution to provide checks and balances against tyranny. Wants to have a mass plebiscite to elect a fearless leader who's then going to struggle against evil and vanquish all these corrupt, self-serving elites. But it's not just that. It's illiberal in its intolerance, not only of opposition, but of religious, ethnic, sexual, and other minorities. And it's nationalist. It seeks to erect barriers and walls and breed suspicion of other countries and promote an agenda of xenophobia and fear. And if you go to the extreme form of this, you can see how dangerous it becomes if you look at some of the extremist illiberal movements like the Alternative for Germany, or at an even more extreme form, the current QAnon, racist, right-wing, xenophobic conspiracy theory and movement that is beginning to take over one of our great political parties. So again, on the how, these days, autocrats don't seize power in one fell swoop. They move along a logic, a 12-step program that I have identified in the book and reproduce here. They begin again in classic populist fashion by demonizing the opposition and denying its legitimacy, and even claiming that their opponents have perhaps committed treason and maybe should be tried for treason. They undermine the independence of the courts and try to make judges an instrument of their political agenda, and denounce judges who rule against them, again, as disloyal and treasonous. They undermine the independence of the media and try and make both private and public broadcasting and other media a tool of their hegemonic political project. Then they go after internet freedom. They go after the autonomy of non-governmental organizations, universities, and think tanks. They try to create a hegemonic world where all independent sources of thought, belief, action, and power submit to the political project of the ruler. And once you've done that and gone after and reduced the business community as well, you then try and create, a loyal group of crony capitalists to get rich while serving your needs. And you reduce the state bureaucracy, the military, law enforcement, and the intelligence apparatus, again, to earn instruments of your personal political control. Finally, all that's left is to rig the electoral rules, disadvantage and disable the ability of your political opposition to mobilize and to vote. And then you have conquered democracy and simply repeat the process all over again. I'm not going to dwell on this side, but I will say that the coronavirus pandemic has been a great gift to autocrats. old-fashioned and, the new generation of populist autocrats. And we should have no illusions that, the downward slide away from democracy began with the coronavirus, but it's certainly been ruthlessly exploited by both democratically elected populist leaders, as in Poland and India, and autocrats who have, I'd say, undemocratically elected or re-elected themselves. And it's a more deeply sobering moment that we've fallen into. So the next question is why? What have been the causes of this democratic recession? And you will note that with the exception of Hungary, all the democracies that have broken down in this period have been democracies that didn't meet the test of liberal democracy. They began with more serious political institutional problems. And the first one was a weak rule of law, with a corrupt and poorly institutionalized judiciary, very weak monitoring institutions. So they might have had counter-corruption commissions, inspectors general in the different government departments, other kinds of monitors, an independent central bank, and so on. But these institutions didn't function very well, and their autonomy wasn't very well respected. So as a result, you get abuse of power. The guardrails that prevent abuse of power are weaker, and you get politicians who come to power and are determined to destroy them. That results in widespread corruption, impunity for human rights violations, widespread or rising criminality, and even political violence. And all of this may take place either because an elected ruler is weak and the rule of law is weak, and they can't kind of turn the corner on political and state reform to move toward a deeper, more liberal democracy, or you elect a ruler like Duterte in the Philippines, who's determined to destroy it all and doesn't waste time, throwing his opponents in the Senate and in the media in jail. And so the second element is this progressive 12-step program of executive aggrandizement of power, with the Constitution, the Parliament, the media, the civil society, for various reasons, being too weak to resist it. A third element of why is severe polarization along political party, ethnic, religious, or other identity lines. And when polarization is severe, people go into their trenches. They don't compromise. They don't listen to competing arguments. They're not making and accepting rational arguments over policy. And as polarization deepens, so does political fear that if you lose an election, you might be eliminated. And this drives citizens ever more deeply into their social and political tribes of identity and affiliation and fear of the other. This is a very dangerous situation for democracy. And it is the situation that describes the United States of America in the last decade of descent into ever deeper polarization. A major reason why Freedom House and The Economist magazine have been downgrading the quality of American democracy. Another cause, by extension, is weak political institutions, political parties, parliaments that cannot assume the responsibility of being autonomous actors that can uphold democratic principles and constrain the bad behavior of an incipient populist autocrat. Very often in this situation, you will either see, as in Brazil or the Philippines, somebody elected as president on the platform of a new political party that really isn't a true political party. It's more like an instrument for the ambitions of the illiberal populists. Or you may see in some other cases a political party taken over from the outside by an emergent populist autocrat. Then going along with this is generally poor economic performance. Sooner or later, if you're this corrupt, you're going to run your country into the ground. So poverty and it tends to increase. Inequality definitely increases with all the corruption. The economy stagnates, governance is bad, and as a result, people become cynical. There have been important international causes of this degeneration, which you know about from my book, including the weakening of democracy in the US and the ebbing of US democracy promotion efforts around the world. I'm often asked, why 2006? Well, this is soon after the US invaded Iraq in 2003 and suffered a debacle in its effort to impose a democracy on Iraq and manage the, what I would say, post-invasion period of American rule in Iraq. And this really soured both Europe and the United States, or at least the publics in those two regions, on democracy promotion. We pulled back, beginning late in the George W. Bush administration, to some extent under Barack Obama, and now even more dramatically on President Trump, from defending and assisting democratic development and struggles for freedom around the world. If authoritarian actors in the world know that there's not going to be any price to be paid for trashing human rights and destroying democratic institutions and norms, they're going to feel freer to do that. In the advanced industrial democracies, Europe, the United States, accelerating globalization has also promoted fear of losing sovereignty and control. Rising immigration levels have promoted fear of cultural and religious pluralism, which has been skillfully exploited by populists who warn their followings and the wider public to beware of the other, beware of immigrants who are bringing crime and rape, and maybe some of them are good human beings. Then there's the social media polarization. This is a major factor, which you might have read the chapter about in my book, but I don't have time to go into in this lecture. But you see it now in elections in Europe, the United States, and other emerging democracies, that social media has become a venue where any kind of conspiracy theory can hatch and gain traction. People don't tend to vet these things very carefully. Facebook doesn't want to vet them very carefully because it wants to fixate people on their platforms so that it can capture more of your data and sell more ads. That's their business model for making billions of dollars. And of course, we have a more powerful and aggressive Russia and China that are pushing their authoritarian values, trying to assist authoritarian regimes in the world, in some cases undermine democracies, particularly in their neighborhoods, and diffuse authoritarian leadership models. And so we're in a new era now of an authoritarian power surge, with crackdowns on civil society, enhanced repression, more efforts, not only in the authoritarian countries, but even in India now, to pass laws making it a crime to receive support from international democracy assistance organizations. The authoritarian regimes, particularly Russia, China, Iran, and so on, are cooperating more vigorously in their own organizations, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They're projecting these opaque forms of soft power to try and penetrate and undermine democracies. And in the case of Russia, anyway, invading their neighbors and trying to undermine their democracies. I think you know about the Russian information war on American democracy over the last few years, which the FBI and our intelligence communities warn is continuing to the current moment. And China, we documented in a report released in 2018 called China's Influence and American Interests, is using a variety of means to try and penetrate media around the world, propagandize, influence or take over the entertainment industry in many areas, certainly by buying not only US movie studios, but using its purchasing power to deter the making of films that would portray China in a bad light. And universities have been very influenced by this. Overseas Chinese students have been intimidated by their governments into being careful about what they say, even in a classroom, not to mention social media in the US or Europe. And you have their global power projection as well, militarizing the South China Sea, and I fear preparing to take over Taiwan by military force if necessary. I'll just conclude with these antidotes. The first one is we need to revive and repair our own advanced liberal democracies. And if we don't do this, and I can talk more about this agenda, both with policy and with electoral reforms that restore strength and vigor and confidence to our democracies and reduce the scope and incentives for political polarization, I don't think we're going to be able to revive democratic progress globally. Fortunately, we do have institutions to support democracy globally, and the Congress is very committed to them. Last year, the United States Congress voted a 60% increase in the annual budget for the National Endowment for Democracy. I'll let you read about it in my book or online just by Googling it, but it is our premier institution for supporting democratic development abroad. And so, of course, I think that if we want to reverse these trends, we need to ramp up our democracy assistance to anti-corruption efforts, to emerging democracies like Ukraine and Tunisia that really need economic and political support. We need to increase our assistance to independent media and anti-corruption organizations. We need to once again use diplomacy and the voice of the presidency to defend civic space, denounce human rights violations, and defend democratic principles. Of course, I have a lot more, but I'm going to stop here and I will take your questions now.
Thank you very much. Is this on now? Yeah, okay, great, Larry, thank you. Let's just turn it on over for questions. We have a few minutes here. Is there anyone in the room who has a question for Professor Diamond? Please, now you should be able to stand and say your question. See if that works. If not, we'll have you come up here.
Major, and a minor in European studies too. But wow, so I have a lot of questions. I'll just stick to two though, and the first one is, how do you not like lose your mind? Because I feel like I'm losing my mind like all the time because of democracy in America right now. And the second one is, I guess you could call it like democratic determinism, this idea that I think a few people subscribe to, that democracy just doesn't work in some places, that like, X country's just not meant to be democratic. And I think nobody really wants to believe that. We all believe that like the whole world can be democratic someday. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that as to like, do you think the whole world can be democratic? Is it right? And, if so, how? And if not, why?
Big and exciting questions. Thank you. So let me say, I do believe the whole world will be democratic someday. It won't happen in my lifetime probably, but I think it will happen in yours. I think we're moving in that direction, despite the democratic recession, in a subtle way. And the reason why I say that is because I spend a lot of time looking at public opinion data around the world. And I think you should too. That's one of the ways you can avoid losing your mind. And, if you read the data, let's begin with the poorest region of the world, sub-Saharan Africa. You find that, people would really like the Chinese system of economic growth. Who wouldn't like 8 to 10%, economic growth for 30 years? But very few people in Africa, or frankly anywhere else in the world, want to surrender their freedom to the kind of neo-totalitarian state that exists in China today. And if you go down the list, forget about the D word, okay? Still around the world, there's so much kind of normative power to the D word democracy that people are reluctant to admit that they don't favor it. And they infuse the D word with everything they want of a substantive nature. But if you break it down into principles of liberal democracies, such as term limits for executives, independent judiciaries, independent media, a rule of law, the legislature making the law and not the president, and so on and so forth, 2/3 of Africans support each of those principles, or nearly all of the principles of liberal democracy. It's a little bit more complicated in Asia, but even there, we've seen until recently that support for underlying liberal principles of democracy was growing even among the young in China. And I have Chinese students in my freshman class now who tell me the same thing, that young people are much more liberal and aspiring of better governance in China than the older generation, which is exactly what you would think. So I think that we're going through a difficult patch now because of the nature of the global economy, the nature of the global media, the rise of China and Russia, and so on. But if we do what I think we can and must do to push back against authoritarianism in the world, to fix our own flawed democracies, and form bonds of solidarity with people elsewhere in the world and push back in terms of norms, values, and understanding, I think, history, morality, and, the generational tide is on the side of freedom. And if you want a little bit of a lift, it might be too much of a lift. You might think it's a sugar high by the time you're done. Read President George W. Bush's second inaugural address in January of 2005. It looks excessive and dreamlike now, but I still think it's one of the greatest inaugural addresses in American history. It's also one of the shortest in American history, and it's also one of the most, I would say, in a certain sense, religiously infused in American history. But I think he gives a good response there to those who would say that some countries aren't meant to live in freedom and democracy. And this falls into the category of the tyranny of low and arrogance and almost cultural imperialism of low expectations. To say that every country should have a right to live in freedom, and that every country can and will eventually achieve that right, is not to engage in the obviously unsustainable and ridiculous proposition that every country could become a democracy tomorrow. Obviously, that's not the case in Saudi Arabia. And a very rapid push, didn't work out so well in Egypt, as Quinn Meekum could explain to you at length. But if you look at the Arab barometer, you see still, after everything that's happened and all of the trials and tribulations and for the most part failures of the Arab Spring, most people in the Arab world would eventually like to live in a democratic and accountable form of government. They just think they'd like to get there gradually rather than by a rapid revolutionary process. And then to come back to your first question, well, I'm a natural optimist, but there are several things that keep me sane. One is I keep coming back to the public opinion data that show, the collective wisdom of the crowd. They don't want to live in dictatorship, and they want to live in dignity, where their individual and popular sovereignty can be recognized. And secondly, I see all signs of hope abroad and in the United States. Abroad, we're now realizing what's necessary to turn back illiberal populism. And I'd say sane and rights-respecting parties, both from the more moderate left and the moderate right, have made dramatic gains recently in Greece, where they came back to power and displaced a left-wing populist government, in Turkey, where they made dramatic gains and took control of the two largest cities in Turkey in the 2019 municipal elections, and elsewhere around the world. And in the United States, we're seeing now, a variety of reforms that I think are going to make our democracy better, more efficient, and less polarized. Ranked choice voting, which I talk a lot about in the book, is about to, I think, be adopted statewide by voter initiative in Massachusetts this year on November 3rd. It looks like a form of ranked choice voting is going to be adopted in Alaska this year as well. A number of states are adopting reforms to make it easier to register to vote, to give convicted felons the right to vote. In Utah, you've now adopted a system of comprehensive mail-in balloting and the technology to, make it efficient and secure. So I see a lot of positive things going on.
Thank you. Please just stand and give us your question.
All right. So I'm Tanner Bennett. I'm one of Professor Meekum's freshmen in his comparative politics class. I'm studying political science, but I actually had the opportunity to live in Taiwan for the last 2 years. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit more to maybe the possibility of China's eventual takeover of Taiwan and the impacts that would have on global democracy.
Oh, thank you so much for that question. And what a blessing it must have been to be able to have that experience in Taiwan at this kind of high point of Taiwan's flowering as a liberal democracy. So China is now rapidly expanding and modernizing its military under a program which you can look up called Civil Military Fusion. It is organizing its military most dramatically around one principle, which is to develop the missiles, the information warfare capacity, and the amphibious landing and other capabilities that would, first of all, push the US out of the Western Pacific and claim it exclusively as a Chinese zone of military action and domination, which is why they're trying to build these artificial islands in the South China Sea and turn them into military bases. And then secondly, I think there's no question that the People's Republic of China is preparing at some point in the next few years. I don't think it's going to happen in the next 6 months, but I think it's no longer 10 or 20 or 30 years away to use military force to reunify Taiwan if they can't intimidate and browbeat Taiwan into doing so. And you now find that elites in China, not only in the government but outside it, are no longer talking about peaceful reunification. And they're no longer treating this as whether force will need to be used, but in their minds, when. I view this situation as roughly analogous to Nazi Germany, lusting first after Czechoslovakia and then Poland on the eve of World War II. And if we don't get smarter than Neville Chamberlain was in Munich in the run-up to World War II, we're going to have the same outcome. So the best way to avoid such a tragedy is the lesson of history, which is strength and deterrence, strength and diplomacy combined to achieve deterrence. My view is we shouldn't provoke China. We shouldn't alter the status quo with respect to the symbols of Taiwan's sovereignty or change the name of it or establish diplomatic relations with Taiwan formally. But we should make more clear than the Chinese are thinking now that they should have no doubt that if they try to use force to reunify Taiwan, it will mean all-out war with the United States and Japan and most of the rest of the world.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Please, sorry, we don't have time for more.
Hi, I'm Reagan Curtis. I'm also a student of Dr. Meekham's and a political science major. I, like Abby, feel a sense of panic studying all of these things. And my first question is, one, how do we go about educating the general public on this backward trend in our own democracy? Because among political science students, I have a lot of these similar conversations. I try and talk to my family or to friends or to other students, and it seems like to them, it seems like all is well. And so it's hard to explain these things in layman's terms to the point that people take it seriously and feel the urgency of it and feel the need to do something. So actually, for the sake of time, I'll just ask my first question.
Well, I'll be brief in saying, number one, try to avoid partisans. Tried to avoid them here. I did not find it possible to fully do it in the book without hiding the truth about a lot of things, but try to avoid partisan triggers and talk about general principles in of our founding as a country, obviously not slavery, but other founding principles, and of limited government, freedom of the individual, checks and balances, rule of law. These are things I think that we can get unity about, and then work out from those principles to see, to what extent we can find common ground, and they can just be more sensitive to and alert to ways in which those principles may be being tested or violated in the way politics and government is being done now in the U.S. And the other is, Megan, patience and persistence. You've sometimes got to work from the outside, around the edges, and just keep working without hitting polarizing, conversation ending buttons, and just try to keep bringing people back to principles that unify us and trying to get them to see what's happening in that light. What was your second question?
I think we better
Right.
end it there,
Okay.
I'm afraid. But thank you so much, Professor Diamond. You can join me in thanking him one more time. So grateful for your remarks.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay.